QT Academy, empowering teachers to empower each other.
So, again, welcome. This is actually the fifth in our series of Quality Teaching Academy member webinars on the elements of the quality teaching model. And this afternoon, we're going to focus on the element of high expectations. And now, if I haven't already met you, my name is Michelle Ware, and I'm one of the Quality Teaching Rounds advisors here at the university. And with me are my colleagues, Beth Filippo and Rob Barter, and also Kate Shorland, who's our newest member of the team, who just started a couple of weeks ago. I'm also joined by other colleagues from the Teachers and Teaching Research Centre here at the University of Newcastle. So welcome to you. As we begin this short webinar this afternoon, which will run till 4 o'clock with a little bit of input from me for about 15 minutes or so, and then plenty of time for questions afterwards. I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land where we're broadcasting here at the University of Newcastle Callaghan campus, the Awalwikal people and the Pambalun clan, and I pay my respects to elders past, present, and those emerging. I'd also like to welcome Aboriginal colleagues who are joining us in this webinar. Now, this afternoon, we're going to aim to deliver these things. So extending knowledge of the element of high expectations, maybe having a look at some of the misunderstandings about this element and clarifying those, and then having a look at some examples of this in practice. Now, there are plenty of opportunities for questions, but what we will ask you to do in this particular instance is maybe just pop the questions you have in the chat, or even just jot them down. And then at the end, we'll ask for questions rather than having questions on the way through. This webinar will be recorded, and you won't be seen in the actual webinar. It'll just be me and the slides. So even though the recording is going, this is for people to be able to look back on from the members area of the Quality Teaching Academy. So rest assured, your beautiful faces will not be all over the Quality Teaching Academy website. It'll just be me and the slides. Now, I want to ask you a question to start with. How many times have you heard people say, well, that's fine for your class, but my kids couldn't do that? Has anyone heard somebody say that? I don't think personally that I've said that, but I know that I've surprisingly heard colleagues that I wouldn't have thought have that attitude towards their kids. I've heard them say that. And it's interesting that those same teachers that say that are often surprised by what their students can do once the expectations are a little bit higher and that necessary support is provided. So this element prompts us to reflect as teachers and really challenge our own assumptions and our often own preconceptions about our students and their capacity to engage in challenging work. And then we have to communicate those expectations, of course, to the students. It reminds us, as Jenny Gore says, to avoid the kind of thinking about labelling individuals or groups of students that tends to sort of reduce expectations. So it's all about supporting students to take risks in their learning and encouraging them to go beyond what they already know and what they already can do, and encouraging them to explore also and share some challenging ideas and perspectives. And that really does ramp up the expectation. It's one thing to actually have those thoughts yourself and to go out on risky thinking and unconventional thinking, but then the next step to really ramp up expectations is to actually then share it with other people. And I think the important point here is that expectations can be high regardless of the school context. If we think for a moment about inclusive education settings, for example, and that we may have people here in the webinar who are actually working in those settings or have units in their school or have students integrated into their own mainstream classrooms. But we can still have high expectations regardless, and particularly in terms of students' complex learning needs in some of our inclusive education settings. It just might involve perhaps using learning progressions or even precursors to plan beyond current knowledge, and maybe consider perhaps the goals and expectations of the parents and the students and how they may be incorporated into the learning experiences. So this is very much about high expectations for all students. So if we look at the model here, we can see that high expectations sit right in the middle of the quality learning environment dimension, where the focus in this dimension is all about pedagogy that creates classrooms where students and teachers work productively and where there's a really clear focus on learning. Now, just to dip into very briefly into the conceptual background behind high expectations, let's have a look at some of the thinking. Two really important researchers in this field for many years, in fact decades, are Brophy and Good. And some of the work, if you're interested, let us know, because we can point you in the direction of some of these oldies but goodies in terms of some of the articles and some of the research they've done. It's very accessible and really interesting and still incredibly relevant. So their work in the early 70s was around saying that teachers behave in different ways to various students. And they looked at the implications for some of these things. And it wouldn't surprise you to know that that there were implications for students' self-concept and, in fact, on student motivation, depending on the expectations that teachers had of their students. And, of course, that also goes into impacts on student not only achievement but behaviour as well. So they argued that the higher the expectations of students, the higher their achievement levels, and conversely, the lower the expectations, the lower the student achievement. Has anybody experienced that in their own practice, or with students that they have, maybe student teachers observing them, or even just in your own experience? Many people done that. Yeah, I mean, I've certainly in my experience have found that as well. Trusting that students will achieve, they tend to rise to the occasion, whereas, the converse is true as well. If you actually don't believe students can do it, often they will just do a self-fulfilling prophecy and actually sink to that occasion. So Brophy says, treat students as enthusiastic learners if we want them to become enthusiastic learners. And even though that was several decades ago, I think it still holds really true. Now let's have a look at a few misconceptions. So I just picked a few that sometimes come up in our quality teaching rounds workshops, and then obviously there may be more, but let's have a look at these ones. The first one is that high expectations element is about how many students are participating in the lesson. Now, this is not the case. It's really the key thing here. It's about how many students are participating in challenging work. That's what this is, this expectation of challenging work. And that doesn't have to mean, of course, that it's only the high ability classes here. So this is another misconception, that high expectations only applies in high ability classes. But in fact, the quality teaching model is based on a premise that all students can learn and all students can engage in challenging and stimulating work. So high expectations are really critical to make the premise of the model actually a reality. A third one here is that you can't code high expectations for a class that you don't teach. And this is a really common misconception or misunderstanding that quite often comes up when people are initially engaging with the quality teaching model in our quality teaching rounds workshops. They say, well, I'm a year 11 and 12 physics teacher. I don't think I can code like a beginning of school, say a first year of school, kindergarten, reception, prep, whatever you may know it as, lesson in writing, because I don't know the first thing about a kindergarten classroom. However, it's really interesting. We've actually had not only people from different faculty areas or from different experience levels or different, even primary and secondary, but we've also had people who don't even have a teaching background coding lessons in our workshops and coding really accurately. So the actual words in the quality teaching assessment and classroom practice guide, and this is the most recent version, but you may have one of the older versions, but the words are still the same inside. But this sort of language really does the heavy lifting, and it really does provide people, regardless of their background, with the ability and the language and the scaffolding to be able to notice and observe things in lessons. And don't forget that in quality teaching rounds, when you're doing that in your school setting, you'll always have the teacher who taught the lesson in that professional learning community. So they'll be able to provide context, not just necessarily just before the lesson, but also during that discussion, and provide information about the students so that you can have a bit of a sense of understanding of what's a high expectation for that student versus another student. But even if you didn't have that information, you can still have a look at markers of high expectation being communicated in the classroom. And it's not always that they'll be communicated explicitly or at the beginning of the lesson. Quite often they are implicit. Sometimes they've been actually established from the beginning of a year and we're talking about a lesson that's later in the year. And sometimes it's the fact that they are developed and referred to and built during the course of the lesson. So there's no one specific way that we want to try and see high expectations. And often it's a sense of what's going on in the classroom, where there is a sense that everybody is expected to achieve. So it's something the teacher has actually set up with the students as well. Now, I know that most of you are familiar with the classroom practice guide, but if you're coming to this for the very first time, every element in the model is set out the same way, regardless of whether it's the classroom or the assessment practice guide. So we've got a clear statement of where the element is present to a high degree on the left-hand side, and to a lesser degree. I'll just put my cursor over here. So this is a clear distinction here between high degrees of high expectation and low. And then following that underneath here, we've got a coding scale. Now, this doesn't have to be used as a scale per se. It can be used as a way of scaffolding the way that we might increase the amount of high expectation in an activity or a lesson or even a task. So you can actually use it in a few different ways. And there's a bold coding question there, which it has the essence or the spirit of the element encaptured in it. So that's a great place to start. And then on the other side of the page, we've got some notes which really flesh out the descriptions on the other side, and some great suggestions that you might like to use to enhance your practice. And maybe if you're having those discussions, that you might like to extend that discussion. Now let's have a little look at what this element actually looks like. So in this terms of the classroom practice guide here, expectations are high when teachers or students communicate the expectation that everyone in the class can learn important knowledge and skills that are challenging for them. And students are encouraged and recognised for taking those conceptual risks or other risks in their learning. And so the expectations are also high when students at all levels are expected to try and to master challenging work. Now, it's not just in intellectual work, it can be also physical challenge or even performance-based challenge. So we're looking at all sorts of challenges. It could even be for a student, it could be a high expectation of a student who's very shy to be able to stand up and read out loud in the class, or for a student to read a poem that they've read, or to perform a song that they've composed, or to demonstrate a dance movement or a sequence of movement. So it can be all sorts of ways. And for some students, that's no big deal. And so an expectation might be that they perform in front of a whole lot of people. Whereas for some students, a high expectation for that student might be that they actually stand up and speak publicly in class. So we know our students and know what those expectations are and how to support them to aim higher with their learning. Now let's have a look at the code and the coding scale. As I said, it can be used really usefully to also scaffold enhanced amounts of high expectation in a particular lesson. So some of you will have your classroom practice guides there, and feel free to actually open those up and have a look at this. So the bold question gives us the spirit of the element. And if we have a look at a 5, we can see that all students in the class are participating in challenging work throughout the lesson. If you're familiar with this model, you'll know that those keywords like all, most, throughout, approximately, halfway through, all of those types of things, they're very much key things that we are looking for here to differentiate. At a 4, we can see that most students participate in challenging work during most of the lesson, but they're still encouraged, and here it says explicitly or through lesson processes. So we don't actually need somebody explicitly saying, this is what I expect of you, because it could be that the expectations are that because of the group work and the independent work that students are doing, that they will be able to do that work because that's how the lesson is set up. And they're recognised for doing so. So you can see there's a similar theme coming through here for the codings right through from 2 all the way up. But the degree to which students, not just the number of students, but the degree to which they're involved in challenging work. Similarly for 3, about half of the lesson. And then for 2, some of the lesson and some of the students. And then at a 1, no students or only a few participate in any challenging work. So that just gives us, I guess, a scale upon which to have a look at the degree to which this is present in lessons and tasks. Let's have a look at an example. Now, if we're looking at a unit of work on, or a lesson on livability, and it's the notion of place and livability, so a geography example, at a coding of a 1, what we might find is that students spend the majority of the lesson creating a title page for the unit of work on place and livability. If we look at a coding of a 2, this might look like students drawing a picture of where they live, but perhaps one group of students in a class co-constructs a definition of the term livability, and they might have brainstormed factors that influence people's perceptions of that. So we can see creeping in here a little bit more expectation, but only for some students. At a coding of a 3, we might see many students defining the term livability and even categorizing factors that influence people's perceptions. They might brainstorm factors that influence these perceptions, and maybe in pairs, they might start to create a livability assessment with a set of observable criteria that could be used. And if we have a look at a 4, the same sorts of things there, for sure, but we've got most students involved this time. And it might be that in pairs, they create the livability assessment with a set of observable or measurable criteria. So ramping up the expectation a little higher. Then at 5, all of those things, but we also have students then critically analysing factors that influence people's perceptions of a place's livability. And in pairs, they might create a livability assessment with a really well-designed set of measurable criteria that they could use to assess livability. So you can see how we've actually ramped up the level of expectation by using that coding scale. Now, I've got a few different examples here, and I'm sure that I want you to really think about some examples from your own practice while we're talking about these. But in terms of alliteration, things like this thing that we saw, it was a year 7 worksheet that they were given on alliteration. You be the judge of whether you think this is a high expectation for this particular class. They were given a sheet and there were 10 sets of 10 pairs of words. So the pairs of words had, and there was an example, and the students had to circle the letter that created the alliteration. So the example was appetizing apples. And so they had, and it was circled, the A's were circled. Then there were 10 more examples where the students had to go through and circle that. And then they had to write a sentence at the bottom for every word they didn't understand. Now, that's an expectation, I think, that's well below what we would expect, because this sort of thing, you'll probably agree that particularly primary teachers absolutely would happen perhaps in year 3 or 4, the students would be quite capable of that. Perhaps a tweak to that could be that if students write 4 sentences, and each of the sentences has to be aimed at a different audience to persuade them about a different thing, and then using alliteration powerfully as part of that persuasion for that particular audience in that sentence. So actually putting their understanding of the power of alliteration into practice. Then if we think about this example now, this was observed in a year 2 class, and the students were really skillfully being introduced and working with and engaging with complex ideas of things like a predator, what a predator is, and the nature of predators, but also the nature of camouflage. And so these quite complex concepts were being skillfully woven into the unit of work on rainforests, and students were engaging really successfully with them. And finally, there's an example that Jenny Gore talks about where she observed a lesson some years ago where she saw year 9, it was a girls' science class, and they were looking at magnetic forces, and they were being introduced to this idea. And some of the girls asked some quite challenging questions of the teacher. And the teacher turned around and said, look, they're year 11 questions. So can you put them in the back of the science book, and we'll get to those at some stage in the future. So it's interesting, they're very different between year 2 and year 9, the expectation that students could deal with challenging concepts in an appropriate way. And yet, in terms of the magnetic forces, where those students were very much asked to, don't worry about this, it's well beyond you, we'll come back to that. Can I just ask if someone wouldn't mind, somebody may have unmuted accidentally, if I could just make sure everybody is on mute, that would be great. Thank you. Now, Jenny Gore has recorded these terrific, very short 1 to 2 minute webinar, snippets of examples of each element. Now, I encourage you to go and have a look at those if you haven't already, but there's a terrific one on high expectations. We can't play it for you this afternoon because it's buffering really badly through the Zoom connection. So just have a look. And if you have a look in the members area of the Quality Teaching Academy, you'll find that you'll see this whole list of every single element with a really short little burst of information. So please feel free to dip into those. Jenny's great to listen to, and she makes things sound so clear and simple. Now, the next in our webinar series is actually coming up in November, and that's on knowledge integration, which is another one of the elements that people sometimes aren't quite sure about. In addition to that, we've got some other professional development that we run all the time, and we've just listed a few of those things there. Most of you are aware of these, and many of you have been to all of these courses actually. So, but if you're looking for some more professional learning on the model, I encourage you to have a look, particularly the assessment and programming workshops that are coming up in 4th term. You might find those interesting, and the programming is a great way to, I guess, prepare for and boost some of the skill level around all of those new programs you need to perhaps be writing because of the new curriculum coming out in many of our schools and states. Now, I'm going to pause there and for some questions, but I guess there's one little thing I want to mention before we go to questions. And I just want to acknowledge sometimes the unspoken classroom code that often happens. And I certainly have felt it in my classrooms, and perhaps you have too, and it really does challenge this code. The code goes like this: I won't cause any trouble for you, Miss Ware, if you don't make me work too hard. So quite often that unspoken code where we have to really think about how we can get past that, where we have this thing, well, if I don't push the students too much, I know they'll behave quite well, they won't arc up. So that's really getting in the way of higher expectations and higher student achievement. So I'll just leave you that because I know that that's quite often the case. And we've got a few minutes left now for questions. And I wonder whether feel free to unmute. Certainly we'd love to hear questions, and I'll do my best to answer those. So would anyone like to ask a question, or maybe you have a comment from something that you've heard in the webinar that you'd like to share, because we have so much experience in the room this afternoon. But please feel free. I'll just give you a moment to unmute or to ask a question. Don't be shy. As you know, these webinars and our workshops very much encourage people to jump in and work collegially. So please feel free to make a comment or ask a question. And if there aren't any, that's absolutely fine as well.
Michelle?
Yeah.
It's Nikita here.
Hi, Nikita.
I was just talking to my director today, and we were discussing engagement and how we can increase that level of engagement, and the focus when we're looking at the circles of practice, especially when we're maybe even looking at the QT model. Yes. If we're going to, and this fits perfectly with engagement, because if there's a level of high expectation to a degree and it's differentiated for students, like what that example you showed is perfect, and it demonstrates a scaffolded area of presenting a level of engagement. But I think trying to present that to and engaging our teachers of understanding those levels and how that can present in a variety of ways. What are your thoughts more so around engaging our students and how that can also be encouraged in a classroom?
Look, so many of these things are hand in hand, and you can't have one element of the model without a whole range of other ones coming in. So it's very much a holistic model. So it's hard to just talk about one element without really talking about a number of them. But I think in terms of engagement, particularly with the model, even though we're talking about high expectations, but again, hand in glove, we're talking about students here taking the work seriously. And so and really being invested in the work. That's what the engagement element really looks like in the model. So when you're thinking about that, then thinking about high expectations, in order for students to take work seriously, there has to be an expectation that the work will be at some point challenging. So I'm not sure whether I'm answering your question, but I think it's about sitting down and teasing this out for what it looks like in your setting, and because everybody's school is different. And for sure, there are some examples, and certainly the suggestions in the model are quite handy, even if there's nothing on the page there that immediately fits your situation, it might spark some other ideas.
Your scaffolds absolutely sparked many ideas, and I think that's exactly what I'm about to try and do, is create a scaffold, or more so like a rubric like you have created, that fits both the creative and critical and creative thinking facet from the general capabilities.
Yes.
That obviously engages that level of high expectation, but then hopefully then transpires into a level of engagement. But and obviously it's going to effectively overarch curriculum and pulling out those verbs of addressing curriculum.
Of course. Now, just bearing in mind, the model is a conceptual framework. So it's where we think about practice rather than having to implement all of these things. So it doesn't matter what particular approach or strategy or innovation that you're doing, or even what subject or year level we're talking about here. It's about thinking about our practice. So thinking about opportunities to engage students through really meaningful and significant tasks. So here we're jumping way into the significance dimension, because the work's got to be meaningful and relevant to the students themselves and also to the world outside of school. But it's also got to have intellectual rigor from the intellectual quality, because we know that when students are given appropriate intellectual rigor and challenge, that they are more engaged in their learning. So here we've got all three dimensions just flowing from one to the other. So I think keeping that model holistically in mind, rather than thinking, oh, we need to have this bit and this bit and this bit, it is really a powerful way of sitting back and thinking holistically. And it doesn't matter whether it's a lesson, a whole unit of work, whether it's a task, whether it's a really casual, informal, formative assessment activity, whatever it might be, or whether you're planning a whole new approach and designing curriculum and reshaping things. It's still a super valuable model to use as a lens for checking back on whether it's producing high quality lessons and high quality tasks, rather than having to have all of these things in everything. It's that really powerful thinking model. So if you want any help with any of that, you've only just to contact us, and we'd be happy to bounce ideas off as well.
That'd be wonderful. Thank you, Michelle.
No worries.
Michelle,
Thanks,
we've just got a question in the chat from Hannah. And she says one thing that was a bit tricky learning to code was trying to work out what would be challenging for student X in someone else's class. What I hear you saying, Michelle, is that this concept is a bit linked to Vygotsky's zone of proximal development, that teachers can be aware that different things are challenging for different students. Would you agree?
Yes, I do. I think that's very well put, Hannah. And I think that there's a lot to this, obviously. It's nothing is quite as simplistic, but certainly we know our students. And even if you don't know the students, there's clear enough guideline and guidance in the quality teaching practice guides to be able to give us a sense of what we're looking for here. For example, in one of the lessons we use in the quality teaching rounds workshop, it's a lesson on food webs and food chains in, I think, year 10. And there's an expectation in that lesson that all students will complete a successful food web, and they'll work effectively together in pairs and groups, and they'll be able to contribute to quite analytical thinking at the end of the lesson about some questions that are posed. So the teacher doesn't say, I expect you to do X, Y, and Z, but effectively the lesson design implies that students will do this. There's no sense that, well, I know that these students can't do it. Not that it's not differentiated, but there's no expectation that some students won't be able to do it and therefore will not be able to complete the web. Everybody is expected. And there's a sense that the teacher communicates implicitly through the lesson design and through the types of things that are said, excuse me, to the students, that this lesson the students will complete the task successfully in this lesson. So it's one of those things that, yes, it's great when we've got the context and we know the students, but it's not impossible. Even if you know nothing about that particular subject matter, you can still look at it quite analytically and look for some of those markers that we see from teacher behaviour and student behaviour as to whether the students are achieving and are encouraged and rewarded for going out on a limb and giving an example or extra examples or explaining what they mean. So all of those little markers of higher expectation. I don't know whether that's answered that, Hannah, but yeah. Now, I realise we're actually at time. These webinars go so fast when we're particularly used to delivering workshops that go for 2 days. So we're just a little quick burst for you this afternoon, and we don't want to keep you any longer because everyone's had a massive day, no doubt. And so I'm happy to stay around for some more questions if you've got them. But that brings us to the end of the webinar. So thank you so much for joining us. We hope you'll join us again in November for the next one. But as always, please feel free to reach out to us at any time. We'd love to hear from you. Email, give us a phone call. We really loved, and if you like to, if you're a Facebook sort of person, jump onto our new Facebook page. It's just brand new, and we'd love to have you there. So thanks again. Have a great rest of the term. We're heading towards the holidays, thank goodness. So all the best and stay safe.
QT Academy, empowering teachers to empower each other.